Hi everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. My name's Larene and I'm going to be talking about accessibility in 60 minutes. So it's going to be 60 minutes of pretty much a brain dump of all the stuff I've been doing in accessibility for the last couple of years. So I hope you find it useful. If the clicker works. Oh boy. Nope. Oh, there we go. All right, we're good. Hello. How are you? It's all good. I'm really relaxed and a little bit nervous. So, accessibility. Universal design or inclusive design is the design of environments, products, and services that are usable by everyone, regardless of their race, of their age, ability, or status in life. Accessibility, on the other hand, is the measure of the quality or extent to which a product or built environment is usable by everyone. Accessibility is the quality or measure of the extent of which information is understood by everyone. And accessibility is also commonly referred to as software discipline in front-end development, within which there's a lot of discussion about best design practices and coding practices to make an application accessible by everyone. And as an ex-consultant, I've also found the word accessibility to be a bit of a magic word, depending on the client. As soon as I mentioned the A word, a product or project manager would magically appear to inform the team that we have no blind users, and so we don't need to do all that extra stuff. There's a little bit more context to it, but this is something that actually happened, and I think I can take a pretty good guess as to why these particular clients had no blind users. So I want to share with you a little bit on how my accessibility journey started. Almost 4 years ago, I started off as a consultant at ThoughtWorks, and I was staffed on a web project, fortunately, that had a requirement that the site needed to meet WCAG 2.0 AA accessibility standards. I had no idea what that was, or even what accessibility was, even though my dad had been blind since I was born, and I have seen him using a screen reader for Windows, one called MVDA, which is an open source screen reader built by 2 developers in Queensland, which is where I flew in from, which is pretty cool. Dad can do all sorts of crazy things on the computer, like creating an archive of history of music, sharing files on large peer-to-peer networks, and probably mining altcoin as we speak. So the first thing I did was look up what this WCAG business was. Hands up who knows or has heard of WCAG before? Oh, awesome. Put your hands up if you've read at least one line of each guideline. Oh, nice. I'll buy you all a beer later on the boat. So for those who don't know, I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the content accessibility guidelines, which is what WCAG stands for. So it is a set of standards developed through the Worldwide Web Consortium, or W3C, the same people who set the standards for HTML and CSS. These standards are developed in collaboration with individuals and organizations around the world to create a single shared standard for accessibility, web accessibility, so that it meets the needs of people, companies, and organizations and government bodies. I found it ironic that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines was possibly one of the least consumable pieces of documentation I'd ever seen. It's literally a wall of numbered rules, 3 layers deep. For example, Guideline 1.4.3 is the color contrast guideline that says text on a background must have a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1. And there are heaps and heaps of granular rules similar to that, and some of them a bit confusing or vague, but they do exist for a reason and are pretty important. That being said, the first kind of takeaway I wanted, or first learning that I had, is that you don't need to feel like you have to have read the whole Web Content Accessibility Guidelines before and understood it yourself before you're able to create or make an accessible product or service. Don't let that stop you. Inside of those standards, there are 3 levels of conformity, which are referred to as A, AA, and AAA. Government bodies by the Disability Discrimination Act in Australia need to satisfy at least a AA level, and AAA as much as possible. There's just stricter rules, and they must do that before they can deploy an app to the public. Most large online companies do try to aim for AA standards as well. And there's been a bit of excitement in the web accessibility community lately because WCAG 2.1 was just released in June this year, which builds on WCAG 2.0, which has been around for almost 10 years. So it's kind of catching up. WCAG 2.0 is probably lagging a little bit behind modern web standards. I think things have changed a little bit in the last 10 years. And while I do say you don't need to read the whole WCAG documentation before you can make your product accessible, I do recommend quickly skimming over each one of the guidelines so that you know what they are, and you might even learn about some of them like I did. Some scenarios that you didn't think to design for, such as epilepsy or nausea. There is a fantastic infographic that summarizes the guidelines, the new ones, by Sarah from a consultancy called Utopia Digital, and I've linked it in a tweet. I've linked it in my slides, which I will tweet straight after the talk. So since I was learning WCAG and trying to implement it at the same time, with no real accessibility experts around for guidance, we were literally copy-pasting these guidelines from the document into our story cards. And I know that we made some parts of the website maybe too accessible, if that's a thing, which made it incredibly annoying to use for the user. An example is super long descriptions and text alternatives for decorative images that actually add no meaning to what the user is looking at, such as a picture of salami on a breadboard. And we also, in trying to create an accessible website, specified the tab order and actually specified our own custom one and overrode the natural tab order, which a keyboard user is usually expecting. And it made it really difficult for our team to add more features to the site because we have to manually update a bunch of custom retrofitted accessibility features in. Luckily, from helping Dad out with his computer, I knew how a screen reader kind of worked at the surface level. It wasn't until I actually started to design and build for screen readers that I learned about all the extra superpowers they have, and they give you when it comes to navigating a document on the web. Sometimes it's even more efficient than using a mouse. And even though it was hard, it was, and honestly, not that much fun. At the end of the day, we shipped a product where a screen reader user could go and order a pizza. And we knew that we were helping someone live more independently. And so it didn't really matter how horrendous the code was, which we fixed, by the way. And I've seen a case of a project where, which was passing an accessibility audit with flying colours. It was an online application for a product where you had to pick up the product at a service centre. The app ticked all the boxes. They'd even done user testing with users with various abilities, including people with blindness, and they were all good to go. They deployed to production. And the first customers signed up and walked into the service centre. When they got there, they didn't realise that they needed to get a ticket to join the queue. And on top of that, the customer was vision impaired and the kiosk had a touch screen. So just because your application conforms to WCAG doesn't make your product accessible, which is another reason why I treat the WCAG guidelines exactly as that, guidelines. There is no silver bullet for accessibility, unfortunately, and treating it as a box-ticking exercise will pretty much always end badly. So the title of this slide, How Do We Sell Accessibility?, is a little bit inspired by my friend Vanessa's talk, which you should all go watch. It's straight after this session. And she will equip you with magic powers to sell DevOps and win. So I want to talk a little bit about how to sell accessibility, or rather how to convince stakeholders in your company that it's something worth investing in. And it's a question that I used to get a lot during my consulting days. So on the screen, I have a picture of what is known as a curb cut, or a wedge cut into a sidewalk connecting the footpath to the road. This simple and unassuming pavement design actually has a really, really interesting history, which includes activists in Berkeley, in wheelchairs, it's midnight, there's guerrilla cement pouring, whilst people are running away from the police. And then after proving the point, the curb cut was officially launched to help give wheelchair users better mobility on the streets. Curb cuts started appearing in the US in the 1940s, and in the 1970s they gained popularity and has become standard throughout the US and the entire world. So there is a principle known as the curb cut effect, in which a assistive technology, a technology designed to accommodate for people with disability, usually benefits and makes experiences better for everyone. And once that technology becomes widely adopted enough, it is no longer considered assistive, it's just technology. A study shows that 9 out of 10 non-wheelchair users prefer to take the curb cut when crossing the road. Parents with prams, shoppers with trolleys, travellers with luggage, and cyclists with bikes, to name a few users which curb cuts have greatly improved their mobility experience. And nowadays, most people don't know or have forgotten that they were originally put in place for wheelchair users. So an example of a digital curb cut are closed captions, originally invented to accommodate people with deafness, but they are actually used just as much by viewers who are watching maybe foreign films or wanting to learn another language. For those of you like myself, I keep subtitles on all the time so that I don't have to pay as much attention to what I'm watching, and so I can look up if I maybe missed a piece of dialogue. Does anyone else do that? Hey! I thought I was the only one. Research has also shown that more than 90% of students will watch course materials with subtitles and have reported that it helps with comprehension and retention. Not to mention, so many rhymes, for something like podcasts or TED Talks, you get searchable text transcript for free if you do make the effort to subtitle your content. Marketing research has also shown that more than 85% of Facebook videos are watched without sound. People are scrolling through their social media feeds at work, on public transport, or walking down the street. They're not going to turn on the audio for you. This is just one example of if you don't have subtitles on your video, chances are it's probably not reaching as far as you'd like, or as many people as you'd like. So, a selling point. If you're designing with accessibility in mind, not only will you likely reach more customers, but give them better experience overall, just as curb cuts have given to pedestrians. And naturally, this translates to things like more revenue as well. So numbers tend to add up. So the numbers do tend to add up when you build accessibility in. So why do we still suck? You might not realize this, but a bunch of the web is largely exclusive to a user who can see the screen well and use a mouse. I'm not sure what the numbers are, but every now and again I will try and navigate an app without using a trackpad. And usually I find that I have no idea where I am on the site because the ugly focus square that tells you where your keyboard is, where your input is, because it's ugly, it's been taken away. And so you have no idea what you're where your mouse is on the screen or your cursor. And I think the reason for this is that accessibility is awkward. Unlike maybe security engineering or performance enhancements, accessibility has a stigma associated with it. Not many people are comfortable with talking about disability. I'm not comfortable with talking about disability. It's a chicken and egg cycle. A company will build a product that isn't accessible, products aren't accessible, that aren't accessible will exclude a group of users, The company has no exposure or no way to get feedback from that group of users, and the company remains ignorant and goes on to build products that aren't accessible. And so that's why it's so important to prioritize accessibility and diversity in every company so that we start to try and break that cycle, or we continue to break that cycle. Things are getting better. So a mind-opening encounter that I had when I first started attending accessibility meetups, I met a woman named Kelly and her really adorable guide dog. And Kelly is legally blind. At this stage, I was doing a lot of reading on what language to use when talking about disability. How do I get it right so that I don't offend anyone? And so that I can lower the barrier in terms of speaking to people who have disability. We got chatting and she said, don't let the fear of offending stop you from saying something to someone who might have a disability. If your intentions are good, chances are they won't be offended. And if they are offended, they'll let you know and you can apologize and you'll be sure not to offend them again. She followed up this story with a bit of a sadder story of how she walked into a retail store and just waited quietly to see if anyone would come up and serve her. Minutes passed and not a single shop assistant spoke to her. She was left there in silence just waiting, and in her opinion, being passively excluded is much worse than being offended. Unfortunately, with the popularity of single-page apps, the web has left many of their users in complete silence. True or false? Accessibility is a lot of work to accommodate a niche audience. True? False? That's a leading question. It certainly feels like it. Thank you. It does sometimes, and especially because the internet is starting to mature a bit more now. With HTML5 and CSS and semantic markup, things are a little bit easier than they used to be. It used to be actually quite an arduous task to try and work out what ARIA labels and things you needed to put into your website to be able to make it accessible, while the internet was still trying to work out what it wanted to be when it grew up. So I have an example of a really simple way to make a website accessible, or a bug. When I got the email saying that I was accepted to talk at NDC, after I was really excited and then really terrified, I decided to have a look at the accessibility of the NDC Sydney website and found that there was a little bit of a bug, but it also made it completely inaccessible to English-speaking users. So I'm just going to play a video and show you. What it's like, what it was like. It's fixed now, by the way. Jacob and Steiner fixed it immediately as well.
NDC Sydney 2018 Vertical Line Software Developers Conference. Google Chrome. Larene. Articles menu. NDC Sydney 2000. Banner. Visited. Link.
NDC. Left bra Sydney right bras.
Navigation. List 3 items.
17. til 21. september 2018. Hilton, Sydney, Australia.
Visited. Link.
Get your tickets.
2 of 3.
Can anyone guess what happened?
F5. But voiceover off.
So the language was set to Norwegian, so the screen reader put on a Norwegian accent.
Voiceover on Chrome. Articles menu. NDC banner. Visited. Link. Get your tickets. Hilton, Sydney, Australia. 1 of 17, the 21st of September 2018. List 3 items. Nap visited. Link. NDC. Left brace, Sydney, right brace.
And there you go. It took 4 characters to fix that and make their website accessible again. All right. So yeah, if anyone knows Jacob or Steiner, or if they're here, please say thank you to them. Is that how I pronounce it, or is it Jacob? Jacob? Okay. All right. So today I want to take you through the 3 most important best practices, I guess, or basics: semantic HTML, color contrast, and focus. and how to know if you've gotten it right. Depending on the scale of your application and code quality, you could go from an inaccessible website to a completely accessible, happy path for your customers within days, hours, or even minutes. And it actually doesn't take much to achieve maybe 80% accessibility or more. Just making sure that you do these 3 best practices well. So let's start with semantic HTML. Who knows what I'm talking about when I say semantic HTML? Okay, cool. So before we get into what semantic HTML is, let's have a look at something which I only learned about recently, which is the accessibility tree and the accessibility API. So here is kind of the insides of a website, or what's happening in the background when you are looking at a website. So you have your HTML, you have your JavaScript, and those build into a DOM tree. And that DOM tree is processed by the browser, and then pretty things show up on the screen. At the same time, another tree is also being generated called the accessibility tree. The accessibility tree will look at the DOM tree and strip out any information that isn't useful to pass on to the accessibility API. And the accessibility API is a standard API that, or a native API on a computer that assistive technologies such as screen readers or switch controls or anything else understands and knows how to consume. So an example of how HTML might translate into an accessibility tree or a node on an accessibility tree is something like this. An image tag will have a source with the image file name and an alt tag saying bees swarming. And so it is passed on to the DOM, which is rendered in the visual UI in the browser, and is also passed on to the accessibility tree as a text representation of it, saying image. So the accessibility API recognizes that this is an image and that it has a name or alt text of bees swarming. And I think that's really, really useful to know to understand why semantic HTML is really, really important. So before semantic HTML, or before HTML5, which is I think is when it was introduced, this is what a lot of the web looked like. It was just a giant bowl of div soup, and everything was kind of separated by divs and spans all over the place. It's fine, it worked. Things showed up on the screen and people could do what they needed to do. But it's not so good anymore. What we want to replace that with is these new tags introduced that have more meaning to them and give your content more structure, because at the end of the day you are representing information on a page, and giving it some structure will help the user to consume that information and make it more accessible. So a very, very basic structure of a HTML app is having the header, which will usually show your logo and your navigation, having an article, which will show the kind of the main content of that particular page, what you want the user to get from your page, a few other different tags for various things that you might use when you're writing an article, for example, and a footer which contains your footer links. So just an example as well, here is on the left what kind of the web used to look like before semantic HTML was introduced, all the divs all over the place, and also I made a point of not using headings because I didn't want the default heading style. I wanted to style a P and make it a different size. And on the right here is the same exact content using semantic HTML. And what I want to show is the difference in what the accessibility tree or the accessibility API will, oh gosh, I've made this really hard for myself, show when a screen reader runs over both of these elements. So you can see I've got them two on the same page at the moment. I'm just going to comment out one. I'm going to change my displays actually. Oh no, never mind. Okay. Cool. All right, so I'll turn on the screen reader.
VoiceOver on Chrome, NDCA11Y, Google Chrome, Larene, window, frame 0 has keyboard focus.
Okay. CodePen's really cool where it focuses on the HTML itself, so you can prototype some stuff in there if you need to see what's happening instead of having to spin up an app. And so we're going to just have a look at the structure of the
Headings
DOM.
menu.
No, we're not, because it's going to appear on this screen. All right, hang on, sorry.
F5, no items in. Escape button.
It's always risky to demo with
Frame
a
0.
screen reader. Okay,
F5, voiceover off.
just going to mirror my screens. What am I doing? That's better. Okay, much easier. All right, let's try that again. Sorry about that.
VoiceOver on Chrome, NDCA11Y, Google Chrome, Larene, window, frame 0 has keyboard focus.
So if I open up
You are
the
currently on a frame. Headings menu.
shortcuts menu for the screen reader, you can actually navigate between different, I guess, parts of the site. So
Headings menu.
So it's been categorized in headings,
Form controls menu.
form controls,
No items in. Web spots. Landmarks menu.
and landmarks. And landmarks is the one that talks to the accessibility API and tries and gathers semantic information from the HTML tags that you have used. So we've got a banner.
Banner. Navigation.
And the navigation is inside the banner.
Main.
Main is the main content.
Content
and
info.
Content info is the footer. So there's a little bit of a catch with the footer. So for
Main.
example,
Navigation.
I want to go to navigation,
Some navigation.
and so I can just navigate it to it quickly.
You are currently on a text element.
If we
F5. Voiceover off.
switch to the other one, which is purely made up of divs, people at the back probably can't see that so well. I'll just zoom in a little bit. Is that better? You can hear it anyway. So this is now
Voiceover on Chrome, NDCA11Y, Google Chrome, Larene, window, frame 0 has keyboard focus.
This is now just all made up of divs.
You are
and
currently on a frame 0, inside of
if I open up the shortcuts to elements on the page again,
no items in. Landmarks menu. No items in. Landmarks menu. Articles menu. Links menu. No items in. Heading. Form controls menu. No items in. Headings menu.
so notice there's no headings because I have no H elements.
Form controls menu. No items in. No items in. Landmarks menu.
And also I have no landmarks, which previously with the semantic HTML, you had the header, the footer, the main content, and the navigation as well. So there's no easy way for me to quickly navigate to parts of the page that I want to get to achieve what I want to do.
No items in. Landmarks menu. No items in. Escape. No items in. Form controls menu. Console button. Escape button.
Okay,
F5. Voiceover off.
thank you. All right. Does anyone have any questions so far?
I was just curious on that one, if
Mhm.
that's a limitation or a specific behavior of that screen reader, or do they all behave similarly?
They all behave similarly, but they do have discrepancies between them. So usually I will check with VoiceOver on the Mac and also have a Windows VM with NVDA, which is free. NVDA is not used as much as another screen reader called JAWS, but that's quite expensive. But people have used a free trial of that to test out. If you really want to make sure that you have your app working with every screen reader, it's possible to test it manually. How do I get rid of this? All right. And also something that I used to do was use spans and divs to create better looking buttons and checkboxes and things because the ones that are built in with the browser are pretty ugly. But just because they are ugly and hard to style, it doesn't mean that you should use divs and spans with ARIA. Because, well, you can use it with ARIA, but you're actually missing a lot of things that you get for free when you can spend the time to actually take the time to style built-in radio buttons that the accessibility API can recommend, can understand, as well as buttons and other elements like that. So just quickly a few things around focus management. I don't want to go through too many things that you can easily find online and explain probably much better in the time that I have right now. But I do want to go through a few things that are maybe gotchas that I've learnt over time. So why do we care about focus management? It makes a website accessible to mouse users and keyboard users, and it's super helpful to know where you are and what you're doing on a page. And it also, if done correctly, it stops users accessing parts of the page that they aren't supposed to. For example, if you have a login screen in a modal, maybe users can cheat and go behind by tabbing. And so a few tips on the bare minimum to make sure that your app is accessible. So don't remove the ugly focused outline. Style it to make it look better, but don't get rid of it completely so that people can still understand where their cursor is on the screen. Focus management in modals. So when modals pop up, because they are rendered by JavaScript, they aren't a part of the DOM and they aren't a part of the accessibility tree because they appear after the screen is rendered, or they're somewhere else on the screen completely. Because usually you would put modals in some HTML, maybe on the bottom or on the top of your HTML file. So when a modal does pop up, you need to tell the screen reader or the browser where to put the focus cursor. And it's usually probably in the first input of the modal. And then once they exit out of the modal again, you need to remember to make sure that the focus goes back to where they came from, probably the main content of the page, or the button that they clicked on to open the modal. Being able to navigate to things, being able to navigate to things that aren't on the screen. There is a way to make sure that you don't do that, or you can block them from doing that. And also, be careful not to use display none or visually hidden when you are supposed to be using the other one. Screen reader users aren't fussed whether or not your navigation menu is open or closed. If they can tab to it, it's all the same for them. And the final one, which is a big one, is tell the user when something happens on the screen. And this is very, very important, especially for single page apps. And color and size. So color is a way to improve users' visual experience, but not everyone experiences color in the same way. And the number of people using mobile phones as their primary device means that simple high contrast content and big buttons are going to be a better experience for everyone. So a few things to remember for minimum accessibility is don't just use color for semantics or for meaning. For example, if a user has not filled in a form element, don't just outline the box in red. Make sure you put some sort of icon there to tell them that they have done something wrong. Users with maybe red-green color blindness won't be able to know if they have made a mistake on a form. Make sure that your contrast ratios are correct. There's heaps and heaps of tools that help check this for you. The ratios are 4.1 to 5 for normal text, 3 to 1 for large text, but it's hard to tell by eye. So make sure you use the tools to work out if you've got your contrast correct. Something I also do like to do is the squint test. So if I squint and stand back from the screen, am I able to kind of work out what is going on? And that will mean that or can I see all the elements that I expect to see? And that will mean that the color contrast is probably pretty close to correct. And making sure that buttons are at least 44 by 44 pixels. And another one that I learned recently is also coding for people who may have dyslexia. So justified paragraphs are very, very hard to read compared to left-aligned paragraphs. The spacing is a bit weird, and it's difficult not just for those with dyslexia to read, but for pretty much everyone to read as well. So let's talk about single-page apps. I mentioned a bit earlier that they've caused a little bit of a problem with how accessible the web is at the moment. But before I get to that, I want to chat a bit about the way the web used to work and how it interacts with a screen reader. So you go to a link and you go to a URL, it hits a server, it brings back the HTML and renders the page. And then if you have a screen reader on, represented by Pac-Man, it will start from the top and read down the accessibility tree, which is usually pretty same structure as your content. So it will read all the way to the bottom, and if you choose to navigate through it linearly or tab through it. So the user decides that they want to go somewhere else, so they click on a link on the page. There's a refresh action, and a new page comes up to a different URL. And what happens is the accessibility API recognizes that refresh action, and it tells the screen reader to go back up to the top and read through the page again. So that's all fine and dandy. That's working as we expect. That's a pretty accessible website. So I wanted to put this question out there: true or false? You need to be able to use an app without JavaScript for it to be accessible. So for example, this app was purely HTML. You go and grab it from the server and it comes back. Does anyone know the answer to this question?
It's false, right?
False? Yes. Sorry, I had to think about that one. So let's have a look a little bit at what a lot of the web is like now with frameworks like React becoming more and more popular. So for those who haven't had a play around, actually, who has made a single page app? Okay, cool. I'll go through it anyway because it's fun. So for an example, a React app, if you open up the site and you do view source, right-click view source, this is kind of all that you see. You will see the HTML body. It'll have maybe a root div or container, and it'll have some JavaScript, which is usually a bundle of all the JavaScript in your React app or in your single page app, whether it's Angular or Vue or whatever you're into. So when the page loads, the JavaScript will create a whole bunch of HTML, get that component ready, and just dump it onto that root div with magic. And then HTML appears. And then after that first initial render, the JavaScript will watch for how the user interacts with the DOM after that and responds appropriately. So when the page first loads, it's fine. The screen reader sees the HTML and reads down as usual. All right, so let's say we want to click on the same link again. The JavaScript sees that the user has clicked on that link. And because the point of single page apps is having everything on the client side, it's more performant, it's faster, it's a nicer experience that way, it's only going to change the bits that it needs to change in the DOM. And so it takes out the old HTML and puts in the new one, and nobody tells the screen reader that anything happened on the screen. So it's sitting there at the bottom of the screen thinking that it's finished what it needed to do, it's finished reading the page, but actually something has happened on the page. And so, yeah, a lot of the web is quite silent after the initial render. So, accessibility I built a React app to try and, so I found the most common problem is with navigation and routing. And there's actually not that much you need to do to get it to work. Unfortunately, in a lot of tutorials, intros to JavaScript and React, they don't teach you kind of this best practice, I guess, or this way, this little bit extra you need to do to get things to tell the screen reader that something happened on the screen. So I have a React app here. So this is just straight from Create React App. And should I turn the screen reader on yet? Okay, so it doesn't do very much. I'll show you what it does. Just turn the screen reader on.
VoiceOver on Chrome, React app, Google Chrome, Larene, window, visited, link. A11YPR, has keyboard focus. Links menu.
So I'm just going to
Visited,
navigate
link,
to
list.
list. So
You are
list and
currently in a
add are
VoiceOver menu. This is a
list and add are my two navigation items.
visited, link, list.
And so that's all it says.
You are currently on a link. To click this link, press Control, Option, Space.
Oh no, I need to press Control Option Space.
Press visited, link, list.
So it navigates to lists, and then that's kind of it. And for those who can see, you can see on the screen that stuff is happening, but nothing has told the screen reader that it's happening. So in order to fix that, I'll show you the code.
F5, VoiceOver off.
Wherever my mouse is. Oh boy. Sorry, I'll zoom in a bit. So here is the root file, the index file, kind of the main file of my app, where it grabs it sets up all the links and all the components. So you can see I have the header. So using semantic HTML, we have a header, we have a nav. The nav contains a list and an add link. This is using React Router for those who are familiar with it, but otherwise if you're not, it just tells it what URL to put to render what component. And so in the list component, we have a very, very simple component. When the component mounts, I've just got some dummy data rendering on a timeout, so random numbers appear at various times. And this is the code to render that. So whenever the state updates, it'll re-render the component showing each new random number. And so this looks pretty standard. It looks like there's nothing wrong with this HTML, but actually there's a few little things that we can do to make it accessible. So the first thing is let's get the focus to focus on the main content when the page changes, so that the user knows when the page changes. I'm going to steal some code here. So this is all you need to do to achieve that. And so adding a tab index of -1, that will tell the accessibility API that this is an element that can be tabbed to programmatically. So using JavaScript.focus, that's all that means. And in React in particular, you can tell it to execute, grab this current element, which is the heading, and then focus on that element. So when it renders, it'll focus on that element. So if I save that, go back to my app, I'll go back to home, turn the screen reader back on again.
VoiceOver on Chrome, React app, Google Chrome, React app, web content. Links menu, visited link, list. Visited link, list. Heading level 2, list, main.
So it now focuses on
You are currently on a heading level 2.
heading of the new component that rendered. So it tells the screen reader that something did happen. Now, how do we deal with the random numbers that show up?
Links menu.
Oops.
F5 button. Visited link. No items and links menu.
Sorry.
Links menu. Links visited link. No items and links menu. Content. React app. Google. VoiceOver off.
It's as simple as adding aria live equals, and so you can pick whether you want the screen reader to interrupt when an element renders in that particular div. So I'm going to pick assertive. It goes with my personality, I think, and we'll see what happens now.
VoiceOver on Chrome, React app, Google Chrome, Larene, window, heading level 2, list, window, content, links menu, visited link, add, heading level 2, submit an
Let's go
issue,
to
main,
another link first.
F5 button,
No.
links menu, visited link, list, heading level 2, list, main. You are 29.86904688886154.
Did that work? I don't think that
You are
worked.
currently on a text element. F5 button. VoiceOver off.
Alrighty. I don't know why that didn't work. That's what I get for doing a live demo. Okay. So if I just go back to my deck. I do have that in a GitHub repo, which I'll share with you as well, if you wanted to clone it and have a look. And I also have a link to a bunch of resources, including a guide to how to use VoiceOver. In the blurb for my talk, I did mention that I was going to introduce how to do accessibility in React and in Vue and in Angular. I kind of forgot about Angular, but I do have the same problem solved in Vue. So the biggest problem is just telling the screen reader that something has changed on the screen, and also pulling the focus to the new component that renders when you're going to a new route. So yeah, now that you know, we can stop accidentally excluding users when building single page apps. So here's a bunch of resources if you want to know more. And some amazing people to follow on Instagram if you have, not Instagram, sorry, on Twitter if you have it, using the A11Y hashtag. So A11Y stands for accessibility, just a bit shorter. Alrighty, I think that's me. Thank you so much. Any questions? Yes?
You talked about using display none or visually hidden and what the difference was. And
So, good question. Display none. The most common mistake for that is that, for example, if you have navigation and you have put it into, for example, a hamburger menu, and removing that from the screen means that that removes those links from the screen reader or the accessibility API. So the user can't use those shortcuts to navigate to the links very, very easily. They actually have to go and find the hamburger button, open up the menu, and then find those navigation links. So that's one of the most common things that happens. visually hidden is, hiding it from the screen, but not removing it from the DOM or hiding it from the screen reader. Yeah.
In my experience, a lot of the pushback I've gotten about implementing accessibility hasn't come so much from stakeholders, but designers. The moment it impacts their design. Have you had any issues with that, and what have you done to try to deal with a situation, for example, like the color contrast is wrong, so you need to change that shade of blue a bit, and they're not happy about it?
So our designer is awesome. No, that's a really, really good question. So actually I had some extra stuff about accessibility as a culture. And so stuff like contrast and things, and that I have seen that happen quite a lot. But having those kind of constraints to work with, I think, makes for a more interesting problem for a designer to solve, and moving all those decisions upstream as well, because web accessibility was commonly thought of as a developer problem. So the software developer would have to make all those decisions about what is the tab order, what do we use as alternative text for our images, and what does the screen reader say for this, and this situation, if they were implementing accessibility at all. And so that's a lot of cognitive load, and it means a lot of extra work for the developer, and things take longer. And something that's really, really important is moving all of those decisions upstream. So accessibility does start at design. And a way, I guess, to get the designer to empathize with the decisions they're making is to get them in front of real users and see how they interact with the app, and see what problems maybe terrible contrast is causing, to help them rethink. Maybe they shouldn't be using, maybe they should rethink some of their designs. Does that answer your question? Sorry.
Thanks.
Yep.
If you've got an existing site or something that you're working on and you want to, at a glance, work out how accessible it is the best way to just try to use it with a screen reader, or are there tools you just run over it and give you a sort of an overview?
I find screen reader is the best sanity check to make sure that it's end to end, you can achieve your goal. There are some really, really awesome tools though. Oops. So if I go to the developer console, oops, that's not it. It's not going to open in that one. Maybe in Twitter. Let's try the NDC website. In the developer console, actually with, oh, sorry, it's over here. Really failing at this today. Come on. Okay. Sorry, it's coming. It's coming. Is that it? Okay. With the newer version of Chrome, and I think Firefox has equivalent auditing plugins as well, but there's actually a new audits section in the developer console where you can run performance, progressive web app, best practices, and accessibility SEO testing on, and you can even throttle your connection to see how your website runs on a slow connection. And this is using a piece of software called Lighthouse. This could be awkward. But it's really, really powerful, because not only does it give you a score for each of those categories, it gives you recommendations of how to fix it. Oh, I'm sorry. So, yeah. If you scroll down after looking at the score, it's really good performance and SEO, amazing SEO. Good job. You can have a look at it's got a bunch of suggestions of things, and it also explains why. So what's it complaining about most of all? Contrast, color contrast. So yeah, it's usually those same set of things, semantic HTML, color contrast, that are the biggest problems. There's also a plugin in Chrome called Axe. So one of the people I follow on Twitter, Marcy Sutton, amazing accessibility speaker. She works at a company called Deck, and they just make accessibility auditing and accessibility testing software, and this is one of their extensions. And so you can download this in Chrome and analyze a website the same way, and it gives you a really, really user-friendly way and of telling you what are the accessibility problems with your site, and it tells you also how to fix them. And what differentiates this from, well, I haven't had a close look at the audit tool, but what differentiates this is that they have a principle that they don't give you false positives or false negatives. They want to make sure that the results that come back aren't telling you lies. It's not flaky, so that you trust whatever comes back, and so that you know that you can fix it and that this is an actual problem. Because one flaky test kind of renders your whole test suite useless. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Great. Cool.
How do you handle accessibility for SVGs?
For SVGs?
Yeah.
I think SVGs, they're... good question. I would not know. Are they generally rendered in a image tag, or are they rendered in an SVG tag? Depends how you want to do it. I don't know. Yeah, right. You could wrap it in a, unless you wanted to give information, you could wrap it in a div or something that has alternative text to explain what the SVG is doing, or just to hide it from the screen reader completely. Yeah, that's probably that's what I would do with what I know about SVGs and how screen readers interact with them. But generally, SVGs are pretty decorative. Is that right?
Yeah, but it's always, I found that they are very difficult for screen readers to tell anything about their image.
Yes.
Inside an SVG, you can add a title and description tag, which will be read, I think, by screen readers.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
To read that.
Tried that, but that doesn't work across all the screen readers.
Yeah, I don't know how to help you with that one.
Yeah.
I guess my experience is similar to the olden days of each browser rendering the same thing differently. It still feels like accessibility tools are like completely different in their implementations. I don't know if that's something you've experienced too.
Yeah, definitely. As much as it would be awesome if you could automate testing of accessibility, it unfortunately manually is still the best and most robust way to do it, at least for now. So having all those VMs and testing through all those screen readers. But generally, if you do take care of all these small problems and make sure that you follow the best practices, you find that, yeah, you generally get away, and at least make sure, concentrate on happy path. So something that a lot of people also think that if they want to make their website, for example, in government, WCAG, AA or AAA accessible, you don't have to make the entire website accessible. You just need to make the most important critical path accessible and start with that, and then work backwards from there if you have the time. Yeah, but with SVGs, I think there's ARIA labeled by, and you can wrap it with a div that has an ARIA labeled by. You hide the contents from the screen reader and have another div that explains what the SVG is. That's you. Yeah. Otherwise, yeah, no, I haven't done much with SVGs, unfortunately. Awesome. Cool. Any other questions?
How about error messages and all, where you don't want the user to be focused programmatically, but still want to read it out? Do you use role is equal to alert, or there is an
There's a few ways you can do it. So the only kind of forms I've worked with recently are ones where the page refreshes. So you try to submit and the errors only come up when you refresh, and the errors are generally at the top above the form in a list, which is quite good, because then you can tell them all at once what all the problems are. But I think it'll come to, yeah, just telling the screen reader that a new element has popped up on the screen. And there's also something that Twitter does, for example, is using ARIA Live to report something that's happened on the screen by inserting text or HTML into just a div that the screen reader can't see, but will read out. sorry, that the user can't see, but the screen reader will read out. I think that's me. Thank you.